FilthyRobot here, just about to start the breakdown of the Baldur Gate 3 classes, and wanted to remind you all that we do not have complete information for this quite yet. A number of these classes are in the game, but only up to level 5 as part of early access, and a number of these classes are not, or subclasses rather, are not yet in the game at all. So the information I'm going to provide to you guys is a little bit of data mine stuff collected on websites, a little bit of my own D&D knowledge going into this, a little bit of previous subclasses, and a little bit of the information released on the games. What this means is some of these things are going to be a little bit inaccurate. Some things that are reported as an action might be a bonus reaction. Some of the things that happen in normal mechanics of D&D may not apply to the Baldur's Gate 3 game. They may have tweaked these engines a little bit. Where I notice these differences or where I can see them, I'm going to try to highlight them. And when I think these are going to have implications on how the character plays, I'm going to mention that. But just a caveat that not all of this information will be exactly accurate because of the sources that we're drawing from. Let's have a look at the Baldur's Gate 3 Druid class. So, what do we got? We've got a full caster, wisdom-based caster. The other one of those being the cleric. D8 HP dice, so not the worst, but not the best in terms of HP progression. Wisdom int saving throw proficiencies. Wisdom is quite a heavily used saving throw in general in D&D 5e. We have no idea what Baldur's Gate 3 is going to do with that. It entirely depends on the weapon, the unit selection the devs have made, as well as any homebrew stuff they've had. So it's tough to get a sense of the saving throw values prior to actually playing the game. But if we were to think about D&D 5e as a system as a whole and try to guess from this, int saving throw proficiency is not very valuable. Wisdom saving throw proficiency is decent. All full casters would really like a con saving throw proficiency for a better roll on their concentration saves, which will happen for all casters using any of the powerful skills. Here they don't have that as a druid, so it's going to be a little bit worse. Druids get access to light and medium armor with shields, all of which is decent. The base D&D 5e rules restrict druids to non-metal armors, which tends to be pretty problematic. The non-metal armors tend to be worse in general than the metal armors for the same class type. So the medium armors are going to be lower AC for a druid than non-druid, and they tend to be rarer. So when you find magic items, you tend to find a lot more of them that are metal than non-metal. That said, nothing on this wiki page says that druids are restricted to non-metal armor. So maybe they have just done away with that rule, which would be fine. Their weapon selection tends to be fairly mediocre. Not martial weapons basically, but some specific simple weapons and a couple other above and beyond that. However, they have a cantrip that lets them make weapon attacks based on a wisdom roll from a summoned weapon instead, which is fairly interesting as a bonus action. And then finally, this druid list here at the bottom says druids can speak to animals while in their wild shape forms. This is the fourth class that I've looked at in Baldur's Gate 3, and it is the third of those 4 classes that have had some version of that class or some ability of that class allow them to communicate with animals. I'm beginning to think this is going to be a fairly heavily utilized, or at least numerous occasions in the game where this is going to be useful. They don't get this in the base games to just talk to animals in their wild shape forms. I wonder if that means specifically like if the druid switches to a bear, it can talk to bears, or if this is a druid and bear can talk to any animal. Who knows? But still interesting to see it there. The subclasses they're going to give us access to are the Circle of the Moon, Circle of the Land, and Circle of Spores Druid. Before we get into that, let's just take a quick look at normal druid progression. Druids get wild shape and subclass at 2. 2 is the range of first subclasses are 1, 2, or 3. So this is the middle of the range for that. For multi-classing, it makes it a little bit tricky to get the druid subclass stuff. Druids also don't love multi-classing anyways. As a wisdom caster, the only other wisdom caster is a cleric, and they have a very similar... It's weird to multi-class a druid and a cleric since both of them are full casters already. And wild shape scales on druid levels. So the value of wild shape is not easily utilized by a multi-class build unless you are primary druid. And the scaling of wild shape is the power level of the animals that you can transform into. All druids start with the ability at level 2 to transform into an animal as an action. Depending on how the game implements this, you can do things like rage and transform, and you can do things like cast a spell. And then after you've transformed, granted 2 actions would be over 2 turns, but after you transform, you can maintain concentration on that spell while you're in animal form. Now, entirely depends on how they choose to interact with that. Maybe that will be supported in their system, maybe it won't. But it does mean you can do cool things as a druid, as like channel like a sleet storm or like a grease spell or something, and then transform into an animal to protect your actual HP. The way that wild shape generally works is when the HP of the animal is depleted, any carryover damage will carry over to the druid's base health. But the animals tend to have a lot more base health than the druid, and the stats of the animal are mental stats of the druid and physical stats of the animal. So often druids don't want a lot of constitution, a lot of dexterity, or a lot of strength, because the animals they transform into will give them those attributes, and the mental attributes, charisma, wisdom, and intellect, will be available to them in animal form. We'll have to see. That's all great in theory. We'll see what the game actually throws at us for that. Druids get full spell progression, which is kind of cool, and they get some really unique spells, a lot of nature-based spells, but also a lot of really powerful control style spells. They tend to be fairly decent controllers. So let's take a look at the subclasses offered to us. At start, we're getting Circle of Moon, Circle of Land, and Circle of Spores. The Moon subclass is one of the, I think, stronger druid subclasses that I play with regularly. What this does is it takes that transform and makes the transform a bonus action as opposed to an action to transform into an animal. So that means you can cast a spell, then transform, or transform, then attack, which you can't do often. And it makes the animals that you get progress faster. So you get better animals sooner. Generally, the weakness of the shape-shifting animals is they tend to have fairly low armor class, so they get hit a lot. So their extra HP pool is not always that useful because they take damage just at a rate that another tank wouldn't. But the Moon class does a little bit to help with that by getting access to better animals sooner. Really, the power of the shapeshift ability on the Druid is going to be totally defined by what limitations you have on that in Baldur's Gate 3. In other words, what animals they give us as the options to transform into. So good animal selection, this becomes a really nice class as a whole, and this subclass in particular becomes very good. Kind of a weak animal selection like they have in Celesta, the unfinished business mod, then the subclass as a whole and the class as a whole gets a little bit weaker. So again, tough to predict ahead of time without seeing what's going to be there, but potentially a nice class. Not very good on a multi-spec generally, but pretty powerful, especially early game and then a little bit later game too. Let's see what else. That's Combat Wild Shape. We already talked through that. Not much else going on in the subclass right now. Not sure what the future subclass stuff will be for that, but a nice class generally in D&D 5e. Looking at the Land subclass. Land subclass is generally the most potent spellcaster druid, right? So here I'm expecting to see some specific spell lists that are expanding the druid spell list above and beyond what they normally have access to. It doesn't say that here, but that's my expectation for this class. And natural recovery, which is basically the arcane recovery skill, which is on a rest, you can expend some version of expanded spell slots to give you more total casts per long rest than other druids without this ability. Again, as with all the full caster classes, the impact of subclass stuff is often a little bit less because a lot of the value of your class comes from your full spellcaster progression, which druids again have. So this is going to be entirely dependent on what these extra spells do for us. But perhaps some of the times that you play through, you want a wisdom caster and you're going to use this as one of your primary caster classes, and maybe the land druid is the thing that you want to pick to for that. All right, let's take a look at Circle of Spores. Got some reading to do on this one. Halo of Spores. Starting at the second level, you're surrounded by invisible necrotic spores that are harmless until you release them on a creature nearby. When a creature you can see moves into a space within 10 feet of you or starts its turn there, you can use your reaction to deal 1d4 necrotic damage to that creature unless it succeeds on a con saving throw against your spell DC. Necrotic damage increases to 1d6 at level 6, 1d8 at level 10. So every 4 levels starting at 2. Damage progression doesn't seem very large. Reaction is expensive. If you don't have other ways to use reaction, this is a nice utilization of that, but the damage isn't great, and it doesn't look like I can do it to, what does it say? You can see moves into a space within 10 feet of you or starts its turn there. Or starts its turn there, you can use a reaction. Yeah, so you can only do this to one creature per turn, even if it starts next to you, because it reuses your reaction. If you are in melee as a druid, you probably want to be in animal form. And if you're in animal form, you have access to animal attacks. So enemies moving away from you are going to trigger your attacks anyways. But maybe you're not maybe you're just getting attacked, in which case this gives you some way to deal damage while you're in melee. My initial read of this is it's not very strong. Let's see what else they do. Also at the second level, you gain the ability to channel magic into your spores. As an action, you can expend a use of your wild shape feature to awaken those spores rather than transforming into beast spawn, and you gain 4 temporary as an action. You gain 4 temporary HP for each level you have in this class. And while this feature is active, you gain the following benefits. When you deal your Halo of Spores damage, roll the damage dice a second time and add it to the total. Your melee weapon attacks deal an extra 1d6 necrotic damage to any melee weapon attacks to any target they hit. It's a 10-minute buff too. 10 minutes. So the way the combat in D&D works is combat rounds are 6 seconds. 10 seconds? Shit, I forgot now. Let's see. There's 6-second rounds. You get 6-second rounds. So if an ability lasts 10 minutes, this is a huge chunk of time. The general basis is 1 minute, and 1 minute is 10 combat rounds. So this is 100 combat rounds. So often you can get an ability like this, you can trigger from multiple combats if you have back-to-back combats pretty quickly. So they tend to be a little bit more valuable when they have a 10-minute spell duration. Looking at this though, so you can burn your wild shapes. You're not shifting, but you have to be within 10 feet of you or they move into you. And as an action, which is super expensive because it basically means you're not doing anything else. You're not cantrip attacking. You're not casting an interesting spell. You're not shape-shifting. You're going to do Awaken Spores, gain some temp HP. It's not a lot, 4 per level. And when the spores do damage, they do more damage, but they don't do a lot of damage to begin with. 1d6 versus 2d6. It matters. It's double the damage, but it's double of a low starting number. And your melee weapon attacks. So this is for a druid who wants to be in melee range of enemies, doesn't have reactions, isn't transforming, and wants to swing melee weapon attacks. It's not a lot of druid. That what I just described isn't a lot of cases that I've found druids are in. Yeah. So that will be interesting to see what people come up with that. It's a level 2 splash too if you don't primary druid. I don't know. Maybe there's some sort of melee druid with this where the extra damage stuff gets interesting. It's just extra dice. It's not extra attack. So you can't even trigger like Rider. Like you can't even trigger like Hunter's Marks or that kind of thing. I really don't know what this is going to be good for. This doesn't initially read as very interesting to me, but I bet you there'll be some interesting builds that utilize this. Whether or not they're good, I don't know, but they'll probably be interesting because it's quite different from what druids normally do. I don't want to speculate on 6 and 10. I'm not sure how confirmed this information is. Best of my knowledge, this class is neither in the game right now, nor do we know what this is. This is probably progression based on Circle of Spores from other D&D sources, and I don't want to speculate on how one-to-one they've translated that. But when I look through the Druid classes right here, Circle of Spores is the third of 3 for me. And Moon is an interesting off-tank kind of build. I'm really curious to see the animal progression. I like the little benefits of... as if you're using animal forms a lot and you can talk to animals, that might be interesting. I don't know if you can talk to animals in combat or how that's going to work. You're probably not going to be in animal form very often when you're not in combat, but maybe you will be, and maybe you're going to be shape-shifting outside of combat to do things, which could be cool. But Druid is a class that I've never really been in love with this class outside of Moon Druid. But I do love Moon Druid, so it's interesting to see that in the game. That might be fun to play with. And Circle of Land is the premier Druid casting class, and I don't know what extra spell lists they're going to give it, but I bet you there will be some for that. So 2 of the 3 look pretty playable, different roles, Moon and Land, and maybe there's some wild builds that utilize Circle of Spores to be interesting. But this all just sounds like a bunch of text that says you do nothing. You may spend your action to do very little and regret it. So... we'll see. You guys let me know what you think too. Maybe you guys can think of the multi-classes where Spore class is really shining, but I don't see it. The rest of it looks pretty good for Druids, but I don't love Druids as a whole. Very interested to see if they manage to make a world in which Druids seem strong. That would be cool. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next one.